At the time of this video being recorded, House of the Dragon is only halfway through its first season, and so far it's off to a solid start. But without it even being a full season into the series, how can we predict that it's already saved the Game of Thrones franchise? Well, it's simple. It already has. Now in this video, we'll take just a quick look back at Game of Thrones and illustrate where this franchise was, where it went, and ultimately we'll look at where it is now and how House of the Dragon has saved the Game of Thrones franchise. I'm sure most remember how dissatisfying the conclusion of Game of Thrones was just 3 years ago. Other than a rather popular petition to have the final season remade, the show was in the books and the once most popular phenomenon on television kind of just went away with a shoulder shrug and one of the most lackluster finales of all time. The show was over. The franchise, as far as television was concerned, seemed dead. Of course, there were stories about a prequel and potential spin-offs, but the fan enthusiasm was essentially lost. It doesn't take much to lose faith with an audience, especially when that audience adores the source material and they feel it's been mishandled and mistreated. Now that House of the Dragon is here, it's been interesting to look back at the original Game of Thrones series. Many fans can break the show down into two categories: seasons 1 through 4, and then seasons 5 through 8. While I think nobody would categorize seasons 5 or 6 as bad seasons, they were the first in the series that displayed some fundamental story structure concerns that were simply not present in the first 4 seasons. It amazes me how tremendously well done the first 4 seasons are, and yet that same series had one of the most criticized endings of all time. Game of Thrones upset its fans, and there were a lot of them. So when House of the Dragon was announced, a lot of people had reservations, and those reservations weren't exactly unjustified. For one, there was already a pilot for another spin-off series focused on the Long Night that was cancelled after it was filmed. Secondly, before that first cancelled prequel, confidence for this series was already pretty low. But behind the scenes, George R. R. Martin had begun conversations with a self-proclaimed superfan of the source material, A Song of Ice and Fire. I'm talking about Ryan Condal. George had handpicked Condal to co-create House of the Dragon based on the fictionalized history book Fire and Blood that discusses one of the most legendary conflicts in all of Westerosi history, the Dance of the Dragons. Regardless of fan and critic reception to the final seasons of Game of Thrones, HBO still garnered a substantial financial success, and oddly enough, the later seasons were more successful than the objectively better made earlier seasons. But that didn't mean HBO could just ignore the critics. They knew that if they duplicated what they saw in the later seasons, story quality wise, for the next TV series in the franchise, it would only be a matter of time before the viewership ratings would mirror the critic ratings. Now, the first part of that equation is deciding what should be next. The Long Night was canceled for a couple reasons, but I think one of the most legitimate reasons to not move forward with that idea is that it was just too far removed from what more casual audiences would be familiar with. Whether you're a reader of George R. R. Martin's books or not, if you watch Game of Thrones, it was a safe bet that you were generally familiar with the Targaryen legacy in Westeros. HBO needed to find a way to marry the immersive character plots from the earlier seasons of Game of Thrones with the visual spectacle that dominated the later seasons. So there was really only one story in the lore that would accomplish both: the Dance of the Dragons. But there's one big problem with this as the adaptation. In Fire and Blood, which is the primary source for the adaptation, it's a bare-bones historical account of the events. Well, one issue many believe Game of Thrones showrunners D&D encountered was not having all of the source material available because George R. R. Martin had yet to finish the books, and ultimately was only able to provide D&D with an outline for the primary characters. An outline from George is actually kind of comical when you consider this is an author who consistently reminds readers that he does not use an outline when he writes. Rather, he prefers to use a Gardner approach so that the writing goes into unforeseen places more organically. Needless to say, Game of Thrones did not arrive to a conclusion in an organic fashion by most accounts. Another problem, it's been established that George was mostly uninvolved after season 4. All that's to say, Adapting the Dance of the Dragons without all of the unique storytelling nuances that George offers in the main book series A Song of Ice and Fire must be done very carefully and with an even keener eye to detail. That brings us back to Ryan Condal. Condal impressed George so much with his fandom and familiarity with George's writing that George actually pitched Condal the idea of adapting the Dance of the Dragons. After this, George urged HBO executives to move forward with House of the Dragon as the first spin-off series to Game of Thrones. Now, if you've at least started the first season of House of the Dragon, you should be able to notice some lines in the dialogue that seem to mirror the writing of George R. R. Martin, and that's no coincidence. Unlike the later seasons of Game of Thrones where D&D admitted that they felt a sense of ownership creatively, that's not the case here, at least not yet. Condal is essentially a proxy for George R. R. Martin, and I'm not saying that as a negative. As we stated before, the source material in Fire and Blood is bare bones, so expanding on that in George's voice as much as possible through the writing has been key in making House of the Dragon feel as authentic of an adaptation similar to the earlier seasons of Game of Thrones. This may seem overly complicated or overly simplified, but that's the point. House of the Dragon needed to win favor of the diehard fans, but also recognizes its continued existence is dependent on being popular with more casual fans, maintaining the more intimate and grounded political drama and propping it up with visual spectacle. At the halfway marker of the premiere season, House of the Dragon has accomplished both. Critics and audiences both have demonstrated this accomplishment in their reception of the series so far, and it's not a sample size of a niche audience. The show is performing exceptionally well, and without getting into spoiler territory, it does a lot of things really well similar to Season 1 of Game of Thrones. They offer audiences high emotionally charged situations that earn our emotional responses. They've painted protagonists and antagonists alike in a similar coat of gray, while subtly introducing magical elements that feel naturally intertwined in this world through the dragons, but are still grounded enough that they do not break immersion. There's always going to be some plot armor here or there, but as someone familiar with the source material, trust me when I say, like Game of Thrones, all characters in this series will become vulnerable in this world. But to the original question of the video, how has House of the Dragon saved the franchise? Considering we're only halfway through the first season at the time of this video, a show like this, if it were going to fail, would have done so at the very beginning. Either audiences would have been interested and dropped off by now, or they do as they actually are, which is increase in size since the premiere episode. Gaining more viewers in episode 2 than you had in episode 1 is a very uncommon thing in television. We waited 3 years. Perhaps that was just enough time to allow the wounds from Game of Thrones Season 8 to heal, but soon enough that audiences haven't totally forgotten. All House of the Dragon really needed to do to save the Game of Thrones franchise was one simple thing: become relevant. And in that regard, House of the Dragon can't be denied. We all know there will be multiple seasons. How many is still yet to be confirmed, but knowing we won't have a conclusion anytime soon lends to the concept that we'll be talking House of the Dragon for years to come. Considering there's numerous projects on the horizon in this franchise in various development stages, HBO is still looking forward with this franchise. Many may have closed the door at the end of Game of Thrones, but House of the Dragon kicked it back open, and at this point, regardless of how it finishes, they just need to hold that door open until the successors walk through next. Now, I predict that it will be the Jon Snow sequel, and in a video in the near future, I'll illustrate why I believe that's the case. Obviously, we want the best ending possible for this current series, and considering The Dance of the Dragons actually has a published ending, I'd say House of the Dragon has that working in its favor compared to Game of Thrones. Let us know in the comment sections what your impressions of House of the Dragon has been so far. I really believe the sky's the limit for this particular series. I'm curious to hear what you all think. We thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you leave it a like and be sure you're subscribed so you don't miss more content just like this coming soon.